In the spring of 1997, a Canadian government search and rescue team was called to the Melville Peninsula in Nunavut. A non-Indigenous researcher had gone out onto the sea ice alone and fallen through. He was recovered. He survived, barely. 2 days later, an Inuit hunter crossed the same stretch of ice, on foot, alone, pulling a sled. He knew from 30 meters away that the area where the researcher had gone through was dangerous. He had known it before he left camp. He could not easily explain how he knew. Not because the knowledge was secret, but because explaining it was like asking someone to explain how they read. The answer involves too many things happening at once to break down into a single rule. This video is about what he knew and how. Sea ice is not like land. Land does not change. Sea ice is in constant motion, forming, thickening, thinning, cracking, refreezing, piling up under pressure, rotting from below in spring. The same surface that held 1,000 kilograms yesterday may hold nothing today. And from above, the two can look identical. The central problem is that sea ice does not announce when it is dangerous. A pressure crack that has refrozen looks, at a glance, like solid ice. Young ice, ice that formed recently and is still thin, can be covered by snow that gives it the appearance of older, safer surface. The light in the Arctic in certain seasons is flat and directionless, eliminating shadows and depth cues entirely. A traveller without specific knowledge to interpret what they are walking on is, in a real sense, blind. What makes this particularly dangerous is the cold of the water underneath. The Arctic Ocean in winter runs close to -1.8 degrees Celsius, the freezing point of salt water. Immersion without a survival suit causes incapacitation within minutes and death within 15. There is almost no margin for error. The Inuit have been crossing and hunting on sea ice for roughly 4,000 years. That duration is not an accident of geography. It is the product of a knowledge system sophisticated enough to keep people alive on a surface that kills without warning. The word for this body of knowledge in the Inuktitut language is siku. It refers to sea ice specifically, not all ice. The distinction matters. Glacier ice, lake ice, and sea ice behave differently, and the Inuit have different vocabulary and different knowledge for each. What this video covers is siku, the living, moving, tidal ice of the sea. The most immediate skill is visual, and it requires knowing what you are looking at, not just looking. Colour is the first layer. New sea ice, ice that formed within the last few days, is dark. Dark grey, sometimes almost black at the edges. This darkness is not a property of the ice itself, but of what is below it, the ocean, visible through ice thin enough to be partially translucent. An Inuit hunter sees dark ice and does not step on it. The darkness tells them the ice has not had time to thicken. As ice ages, it lightens. Ice that has survived a full year, called Yupik in some dialects, is white or slightly blue-white. It is denser, fresher. Sea ice gradually expels its salt as it ages, becoming more like freshwater ice, and structurally more reliable. The colour gradient from dark to white is a rough thickness gauge readable from a distance. Snow complicates this. A dusting of snow over young dark ice neutralises the colour cue entirely. This is when the other senses come in. Sound is the second layer. An Inuit hunter crossing ice they are uncertain about taps it with a harpoon shaft or a walking staff as they go, not hesitantly, but as a practiced rhythm, the way a blind person uses a cane. Thin ice has a different acoustic signature than thick ice. Thick old ice returns a flat, dense sound. Thin ice sounds hollow, a slight ring, a slightly lower pitch. Ice with water on top of it sounds different again. The hunter is not guessing. They are reading a physical property of the ice through its response to impact. Texture is the third layer. The surface of reliable old ice is rough, wind-scoured, granular, matte. New ice that has frozen recently in calm conditions is smooth and slightly lustrous. Under snow, this is readable by foot as much as eye. The feel of the surface under a boot or a sled runner. Hunters sometimes describe knowing ice was young from the way the snow felt on top of it, which is a function of how the snow bonded to the ice surface during formation. Pressure ridges deserve particular attention. When two ice sheets collide, the ice buckles upward into ridges, sometimes several meters high. The ridges themselves are usually solid. The danger is at their base, on either side, where the ice was under tension during the collision and may have fractured. A hunter who sees a pressure ridge and walks straight over it is taking a risk that can be avoided by reading the fracture patterns at the base before committing to the crossing. The Inuktitut language has over 50 terms for different states and types of sea ice. This is not a curiosity of linguistics. It is the architecture of a knowledge system, each term encoding a specific combination of age, thickness, surface condition, behavior, and danger level that would take several sentences to describe in English. Sikuliak means new, thin sea ice. Ice that has formed recently and cannot be trusted with weight. Ivanik is a pressure ridge. Unik is a polynya, an area of open water that persists through winter because of wind or tidal currents, and which is both a hunting site and a hazard. Chinu is slushy, newly forming ice at the edge of open water. Each of these is a distinct category with distinct behavioral rules attached to it. The vocabulary exists because the categories are real and the distinctions matter. When a hunter identifies a surface as Sikuliak versus Yukiuk, they are not describing a subtle aesthetic difference. They are making a decision about whether to cross. This knowledge is not written down. It is transmitted through observation and practice, beginning in childhood. Children from hunting families cross the ice first with adults, watching what the adults look at, hearing what they say, eventually being told to assess a section themselves before the adult confirms or corrects. Claudio Aporta, a researcher who has studied Inuit sea ice knowledge extensively, describes hunters in their 60s and 70s who can still name every section of a sea ice route they first travelled as children. The specific places that were reliable, the specific places that required caution, and why. The routes themselves are knowledge objects. An Inuit sea ice trail is not simply a path. It is a documented record of ice behaviour at specific locations across multiple seasons, held in the memory of the community. Which sections freeze first? Which sections are affected by tidal currents? Where the polynyas form? Where the pressure ridges build? Where the thin ice hides under snow in spring? In 2008, a group of researchers, including Shari Fox Gearherd and Henry Huntington, published a study comparing Inuit traditional sea ice knowledge with instrumental measurements across the same areas of Nunavut. What they found was that the Inuit descriptions of ice behaviour, which locations were dangerous, in which seasons, which routes were reliable, how the ice had been changing over decades, were consistent with, and in several cases, more granular than the data collected by satellite and sensor. The hunters were not estimating. They were reading a physical system they had studied in detail across their entire lives, using a framework built by 4,000 years of people doing the same. Igor Krupnik, an anthropologist who spent years documenting Inuit and Yupik sea ice vocabulary, found that the knowledge was not merely practical, but predictive. Hunters could forecast ice conditions for the coming days based on temperature trends, wind direction, tidal timing, and the current state of the surface, a form of short-range forecasting built entirely from direct observation and pattern recognition. What the research also documented, and what hunters have been describing for years, is that this knowledge is under pressure. Arctic sea ice is changing faster now than at any point in the last 4,000 years. Ice that was reliably safe in a specific location in November is no longer safe in November. Routes that held for generations do not hold. The knowledge system was built for a set of physical conditions that are shifting, and several hunters interviewed for these studies described the genuine difficulty of applying what they had been taught to ice that no longer behaves as it did when they learned. The knowledge is not failing. The ice is changing. An Inuit hunter crossing sea ice is doing something that looks, from the outside, like walking. What they are actually doing is running a continuous real-time assessment of a dynamic surface using visual, auditory, and tactile input, cross-referenced against a detailed spatial and seasonal knowledge of that specific location, filtered through a conceptual vocabulary that encodes thousands of hours of accumulated observation. The researcher who fell through the ice in 1997 was not careless. He was simply reading a surface in a language he had never been taught. That is the whole of it. Not magic, not instinct. A skill so thoroughly learned it no longer looks like a skill. If you made it this far, thank you. The research for this one took longer than expected. The academic literature on Inuit sea ice knowledge goes back decades, and I wanted to get the specifics right, rather than flatten them into something simpler than they are. If you want more videos on how people developed deep knowledge of extreme environments, subscribe. And if there is a specific group, technology, or place you want covered, leave it in the comments. I read them all.